Have you ever considered the possibility of a war against birds? Now, it might sound like a concept straight out of a quirky movie, but believe it or not, this happened in the realm of reality. Allow me to take you back to the year 1932, to the sun-baked plains of Western Australia, where an unusual conflict known as the Emu War unfolded. This was not a war in the traditional sense, no. There were no political ideologies at stake, nor territorial ambitions. This was a war of survival, a struggle between man and bird. And not just any bird, we're talking about the emu, a flightless creature standing up to 6 feet tall with a rather imposing presence. Imagine this. Thousands of these large ostrich-like birds descending upon the wheat fields, wreaking havoc on the crops. It's a sight that would certainly be etched in the minds of those who witnessed it. But what makes this part of history even more fascinating is the involvement of the Australian military. Soldiers armed with machine guns were deployed to tackle this feathery foe. It's almost comical to think about, isn't it? Soldiers versus birds. But this was a real issue that had serious implications for the Australian wheat growers. Their livelihoods were at stake. So the question begs, so how did this peculiar war come about? The story begins with the wheat growers of Australia. Their quest to protect their crops, these innovative farmers brought in a rather unusual ally, the emus. To Australia, these tall, flightless birds were a common sight across the country. Yet, in the wheat fields, they served a very specific purpose. Farmers had a problem. Pests were ravaging their crops, threatening their livelihoods. Methods of pest control had proven ineffective, so they decided to try something different. The emus, they reasoned, would eat the pests and thus protect the wheat. It was a simple, natural solution to a complex problem. Their plan seemed to be a resounding success. Emus did indeed eat the pests, and the wheat thrived. Farmers were pleased, their crops were safe, and they had found a sustainable, eco-friendly form of pest control. Emus, for their part, were happy with their new home. They had plenty of food and space to roam, but as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. Ample food and no natural predators, the emu population began to explode. Birds, once beneficial, were now consuming more than just the pests. They started to feast on the wheat itself, causing significant damage to the crops they were meant to protect. The farmers watched in dismay as their fields were decimated by the very creatures they had brought in to save them. They had traded one problem for another, and this new problem was far bigger. Emus, with their voracious appetites and rapid breeding, were a force to be reckoned with. The situation was spiraling out of control. The farmers had no choice but to seek help. Did they know their call for assistance would lead to one of the most unusual conflicts in history, a war against emus? The emus, once seen as beneficial, soon became a problem too big to ignore. Imagine thousands of large, flightless birds rampaging through your crops. Picture this, emus, standing tall at almost 2 meters, with their shaggy feathered bodies and long, powerful legs, descending upon the wheat fields in droves. As you watch, they begin to feast, unbothered by your presence. The emus, initially brought in by the Australian wheat growers themselves, were now a problem of monumental proportions. Their numbers had swelled, and the vast expanses of wheat fields provided a seemingly endless buffet. Day after day, the emus would arrive, their insatiable appetites driving them to decimate the crops. The wheat growers watched in despair as their fields were razed to the ground, the fruits of their hard labor disappearing into the stomachs of these towering birds. In an attempt to salvage what they could, the wheat growers tried to control the situation. Some would stand guard over their fields, chasing away the emus as they approached. Others tried to build fences to keep the birds out, but these proved to be futile efforts. The emus were relentless. They would return, again and again, their numbers seemingly unaffected by the growers' efforts. The situation turned from bad to worse. The wheat growers, once hopeful and proud, were now on the brink of despair. Their livelihoods were being threatened, their dreams shattered by the very birds they had brought in with such optimism. It was clear that the emus were not just a nuisance, they were a destructive force that needed to be reckoned with. The wheat growers could not do it on their own, they needed help. Desperate, the wheat growers turned to the Australian government for help. They hoped that together they could find a solution to the emu problem, a way to regain control over their fields and their futures. In an unlikely turn of events, soldiers were called in to fight birds. Yes, you heard it right. the Australian government, in a rather unconventional move, decided to deploy the military to combat the burgeoning emu population. This decision was mainly driven by the growing concerns of farmers whose crops were being devastated by these large, flightless birds. The 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery, led by Major GPW Meredith, was commissioned for this unusual mission. The soldiers were armed with 2 Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, a testament to their initial confidence. They believed it would be a straightforward task, a simple matter of using their military training to bring down the bird population. But the emus, it seems, had different plans. The operation commenced in late October of 1932. The soldiers thought they would easily outsmart the emus, but these birds proved to be incredibly resilient and elusive. The emus scattered in all directions when the soldiers approached, making it difficult to target them effectively. Additionally, the tough hide of the emus seemed to absorb bullets, making them even more challenging to bring down. The soldiers then tried mounting one of the guns onto a truck for a mobile attack. However, the terrain proved too rough for the vehicle, and the emus could easily outrun it. It was becoming clear that the emus were not the easy targets the soldiers had initially thought. As the operation continued, the soldiers found themselves increasingly outmatched. They had underestimated the emus' survival instincts and their ability to adapt to threats. The birds seemed to have a knack for evading their pursuers, a skill honed by years of living in the wild. In the end, despite their best efforts, the soldiers were overwhelmed by the sheer number of emus. The Emu War was turning out to be a war they were ill prepared for, a fact that would become even clearer in the aftermath of this unusual conflict. So, what happens when a war against birds ends? In the aftermath of the Emu War, Australia was left with more questions than answers. The country had waged a war against a flightless bird, and it hadn't gone as planned. The public reaction was a blend of bewilderment, amusement, and criticism. The international community was equally bemused. The Emu War was a spectacle that made headlines around the world, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was Australia, a nation known for its ruggedness and resilience, engaged in an unsuccessful battle against birds. The war had a profound impact on the soldiers involved. They had been trained for combat against human enemies, but found themselves outwitted by a flock of birds. The emus proved to be resourceful opponents, using their speed and unpredictability to evade the soldiers' bullets. The soldiers returned home, not with tales of victory, but with stories of being outsmarted by emus. The emu population, on the other hand, demonstrated remarkable resilience. Despite the onslaught, their numbers recovered relatively quickly. Today, the emu remains an important part of Australia's wildlife and national identity, a symbol of endurance and survival. The wheat industry, which had been at the heart of the conflict, faced continued challenges. The emus were just one of many threats to the crops. Drought, pests, and market fluctuations all posed significant risks. The Emu War had offered a temporary and ineffective solution to a complex problem. In the long run, farmers had to seek more sustainable methods of protecting their crops and livelihoods. The Emu War also sparked a broader conversation about human-wildlife conflict. It highlighted the need for balanced and humane approaches to wildlife management. The war underscored the importance of understanding and respecting the natural world rather than trying to dominate or control it. In retrospect, the Emu War was a lesson in humility. It showed that nature, in all its unpredictability and complexity, cannot be easily controlled or conquered. It reminded us of the need for harmony and coexistence, for finding ways to live alongside the wild rather than against it. The Emu War, a bizarre episode in history, serves as a reminder of the unpredictable consequences when humans interfere with nature.